Thank you. I also went to school in Cedar City, so I guess in this crowd I'm all right. So Celeste asked me to talk about monitoring and maybe stuff that hold up in court and all those things you could do. And I'll tell you my experience with monitoring. I've been an extension agent for over 26 years, and I've taught monitoring all over in Wyoming, everywhere, and taught a lot of monitoring classes. About 15 years ago, Region 4 of the Forest Service came out and said, permittees are going to have to do their own monitoring. That's just going to be the way it is. And so they came to Extension and said, you got to teach these guys how to monitor, because we're not going to monitor anymore, they're going to do their own. So we got a grant and we geared up and we taught monitoring workshops all over the state of Utah. We gave out really cool things like nested frequency frames. We had Dutch oven dinners, had a lot of good visits, taught over 200 ranchers how to monitor. So as part of this grant, they wanted us to follow up and see what happened for all our efforts. And so a year later, we contacted those 200 plus ranchers and asked them how many were monitoring. Guess how many were monitoring? One. So I'm going to tell you about another project that I worked on. So I've been a long-time member of the Society for Range Management. And the Utah section came to me and said, we want you to be chairman of the Rangeland Reference Committee. We want to gather all this reference material, what rangelands look like, and all the exclosures in the state, and make a book. And so I went out and started gathering rangeland, well, exposure data. What I found is we put in a ton of exposures, especially with the grazing acts and those things in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I got a big list of them, and you start going to a lot of them, and none of them been maintained, the fences are down, and so there's no data. So I was wondering what I was going to do, and so I started looking at repeat photos. And I started gathering up repeat photos, and then a few years ago at a conference I met a researcher from Utah State who was in the political science department of all places, who was also looking at repeat photos. His name was Dr. Charles Kay. He was a wildlife ecologist, and he wanted to look at them to see what they showed about wildlife populations. If this country was teeming with wildlife like they say, the vegetation should reflect that. If you got old photos, they should show all this wildlife impact to that vegetation. And so we've worked for a long time. Maybe. So what's the point with repeat photos? This is a famous photo, and it shows up in the newspaper, especially the Salt Lake Tribune, once in a while. This is the Mountain Meadow Massacre site, and I don't know how well you can see this, but that gentleman sitting on his coffin is John D. Lee, and they're about to put him to death for his role in the Mountain Meadow Massacre, a tragic event in Utah's history. This was 19 and a half years after it happened. This Mountain Meadows area was where people stopped when they were coming to Las Vegas. There were some wet meadows there that grazed their livestock, get everything fattened, because they had to cross this desert, and the next place they had really good water and grazing was right here in Las Vegas, which Las Vegas means the meadows. So they camped there. Anyway, some settlers were massacred, and they convicted one person, and they were going to put him to death, so they took him back out to the Mountain Meadows site, and there he is sitting on his coffin just before they shoot him. So that's an interesting photo, but what's really kind of interesting is if you look at that ridge in the background, you see it's a bare ridge, there's some patches of oak on it, and a very few pinyon juniper. So a few years I hiked back down there. I want you to notice the rocks right behind John D. Lee, and Reid took that photo. That's what it looks like today. So what's happened? That grass in the foreground is Russian wild rye, one of the most drought-tolerant grasses. It's no longer a wet meadow. It formed a creek through there. You can see the cottonwoods on the creek, dried out the uplands, but look at the ridge in the background. Completely covered with pinyon juniper. So there's 100 and something years. That's what those photos show us. Look at the tremendous change that's happened. So if you look at the upper photo, if you can see it, in the lower photo, you can see what pinyon juniper's done in 100 years. So we started gathering these photos. One of the things we wanted them for was they give us valuable data on long-term vegetation change, and they're easily interpreted by the general public. All of you can look at them. You don't need a course in monitoring. You don't need a PhD in range management to interpret those photos. And they're kind of random. They were taking those photos from some other reason. They weren't taking them so 120 years later we could look at range condition. We do have a website. It's extensionusu.edu. RRA has 2,000 of these repeat photos from southern Utah on it. And so you don't want to wade through all 2,000. They're searchable by vegetation type. If you put aspen in the vegetation type, it'll only bring up the photos that show aspen. So if you just look at a few of them photos, this is one that's in your book that we provided for you. This is Fish Lake. The photo on the right is Twin Creek. That's 1899. That's July 24th, which is a big holiday in Utah. And that's all the LDS members up there having a get-together at Fish Lake. And they're in their RVs, which in 1899 was a covered wagon. But you can see Twin Creek covered with willows. That's where Twin Creek runs into Fish Lake. There's a few conifers in it, but all willows and very little sage, a lot of forbs. 2000, that's what it looks like today. The conifers have about taken over and pushed out all the willows. We've turned it to sagebrush, and of course they built a lodge there, and there's an amphitheater. But a lot of changes. And if you look across the lake, on the east side of the lake, a lot of aspen in the early photo. In the later photo, lots of conifers. It's Hogun Ranch in the Paradise Valley. You can look what the ranch looked like in 1902. Look what the conifers look like in the background by 1995. Look what's happened. This is Panguitch Lake. This is a famous photo. 1872 was the early photo. That's by John Hillers. He was a photographer with John Wesley Powell. And they made their way out of the Colorado River during the winter, and they took that photo. Of course, Panguitch Lake is a natural lake, but they have since added a dam to increase the water storage. But I want you to look at the conifers at the toe of that slope. See what they were in 1872 and look what they are today. Now look in the background. You see mostly aspen on the far side of the lake. Look in the 1999 photo. Big changes across the landscape. Riparian areas. This is the Escalante River in 1933. Not a stick of woody riparian vegetation on the Escalante River. This is on private land. It's been grazed every year. By 2004, you see Russian olive and a few salt cedars, but it's also got willows and cottonwoods in it. This is Salina Creek, 1912. Not a stick of woody riparian vegetation on that creek. By 1999, it's chock full of willows. It's got beaver and trout in it. So why do we need 2,200 photos? It's so we can put together a chart like this. And so it just tells you the vegetation type. A decrease would mean there was a decrease in that vegetation type in the number of photos we have. 0 means there was no change. And an increase means there was an increase in those photos. So we got about 1,000 photos of grassland. 480 of them show a decrease. 479 show no change, and only 71 show an increase. Look at pinyon juniper. We got 1,000 photos of pinyon juniper. 14 show a decrease in pinyon juniper. 31 show no change, and 962 of those 1,000 photos show an increase in pinyon juniper. Okay, aspen, decrease, conifers, big increase. But you go down the riparian areas, and this is part of your story, they're doing much better. Plant cover, which is an important measure, it's better. Erosion, better. So our rangelands, our riparian areas have improved over time, and we got lots of photos to show that. So one of the things you're hit with all the time is riparian communities, right? So a few years ago, some people from Northern Arizona University came out and said that livestock grazing's been a problem in those riparian areas. They specifically stated that livestock should be removed from all BLM and Forest Service lands to protect riparian areas. They claimed that only the woody riparian vegetation along the Fremont River in Capitol Reef National Park did not recover until they made it a national park and removed all livestock grazing. And they said that all these lands in private hands are in exceedingly poor shape and they won't recover until the livestock's removed. So Charles Kay, they had a grant, he went down and started repeating every photo he could find on the Fremont River inside Capitol Reef National Park as well as outside, all the way down to Hanksville, Utah. And And it's a mix of BLM and private property. The private property and the BLM ground is grazed by cattle each and every year. He found 38 photos he could repeat, some dating back to 1894. And in all cases, woody riparian vegetation increased, often dramatically, along those rivers. In addition, he found 59 images along the Fremont River outside the park, and 50 of those photo sets, woody riparian vegetation increased such there was no difference inside or outside the park. 9 photos outside the park, there was no change in the riparian vegetation, and this was because there were dams and roads put in the way that completely changed the riparian area. So if you throw those out, contrary to Fleischner's claim that riparian vegetation would only recover if we took off grazing, that's not what the photos show. So they did the same thing along the Henry Mountains and found the same results. So there's one of them photos. That's the Fremont River in 1942. That wasn't taken to show vegetation change. I think that was a Ford guy pointing out that that guy had to have a team of horses pull a Chevy around. But that's been grazed by livestock every year since 1942. That's what it looks like today. This is along the Fremont River in 1938. You can see some cottonwoods far in the background. 2012. Look at the riparian vegetation been grazed by livestock every year. So in the Henry Mountains, what the photos show, that there's no widespread decline in riparian species attributed to livestock grazing. We found this in the Fish Lake that you got the book on, found it in the Centennial Mountains, similar to observed what was in San Juan County, reported along Kanab Creek in southern Utah. Webb et al., they took 3,000 repeat photos of riparian areas in Utah and Arizona and New Mexico, and they state the same thing, that in most cases, these riparian areas have done just fine in the presence of grazing. So of their 3,103 photos, 80% of their photos showed riparian species improved, 10% declined, and 10% remained unchanged. So contrary to Fleischner's prediction that the only way to improve riparian areas in these areas is to remove livestock, that's not what the photos show. So I got some questions for you. What if your grandfather took 2 pictures every year at the time you turned your livestock out and the time they went out of the allotment? What if you and your father continued to do this in the present day? Just take 2 photos. When you go into an allotment, when you go in, when you come out. What would they show? Could people argue with you about the condition of the range or effect of livestock grazing? What if every year you did or every few years you did some simple monitoring in addition to the photos? And when would be a good time to start doing this? 5 years from now? 10 years from now? Okay, how many of you got smartphones with really good cameras now that you pack on your side all the time, just like a pistol? Hey, this is Cottonwood Creek. This is one of the driest sites there is. Got poor soils. 1964, that's what the range condition was. 2012, that's what it is. So what can we say? This is grazed by livestock every year. Because somebody took the photos, we can say in that area, range condition is greatly improved. I'll just leave you with this. This is a famous photo taken by the photographer Timothy O'Sullivan. He went around the West and taking photos, and he labeled this photo Paiute Indians near Cedar City. So I'd like to repeat that photo. So I carry it around in my truck every day, and I look, and guess what? I can't find where that is. For a couple things, near Cedar City isn't good enough description. He did not get the skyline in the background. And I wouldn't doubt the background is dramatically changed since 1872 when that photo was taken. So if you're going to take photos, in addition to taking them, make sure you write down or GPS tag them or something so you're not running around looking at those photos, looking for them in future years. So I know you guys like to hear from ranchers. I've learned that in 26 years, and so we're going to bring a rancher up here to talk to you about monitoring, what his experience